Hello, everybody. Happy day 3. You made it. This is incredible. My name's Dan Albert. I'm the executive director of the Solana Foundation. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you to everyone who's made this production possible. So I want to talk about what is sometimes a rather contentious and a little unsexy topic, which is decentralization, centralization, or lack thereof. Depending on your perspective, this is a good thing, this is a terrible thing, and no one on Twitter can seem to agree on it. What I wanted to talk about here is, like, what is decentralization? Why do we care? Why should people care? What can we do at the Solana Foundation as the broader Solana community to promote decentralization? And how do we think about this, right? How is Solana doing? There's a lot of different ways that we can measure, quantify, kind of argue about what is decentralized enough, what does this mean? You know, there's not a single black and white metric that kind of makes this definition. But what I want people to understand is, like, how, at least for me, kind of how Solana Foundation views this incredibly important topic, but also how the Solana network is doing and how some of our members here kind of think about this and what it can really bring to the whole Solana universe. So I want to introduce our panelists. We have Felix from Chorus One and Chris from Chainflow. Now, Chorus One and Chainflow, these are some of our most OG validators. They've brought a lot to the network. Both of these guys were around when Solana mainnet launched. They were around even before that. They helped us get testnet running, helped us get mainnet running, helped design a lot of kind of the early decentralization principles of Solana. So thank you guys for being here. So I guess I'm kind of going to open with, like, this first big idea is, like, why should people care about decentralization, right? We've got all this wonderful tech. Solana's super fast. It's got these amazing properties. And there's all this argument, decentralization, is it centralized or not? So Chris, maybe I'll start with you. I know you've done a lot of thinking and writing on this topic. So, like, why should anyone who's developing on Solana, thinking about this chain or the other chain, why should they care?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. I think, to me, centralization is really the foundation of why we're here. And without decentralization, really not a lot of these other things matter. At Chainflow, for example, we're hoping to build crypto infrastructure for a better future, essentially. And to us, that means that, everybody hear me or not? No?
No. Shout. New York style. You gotta.
Yeah. Is this better? Yeah. So basically, to me, without decentralization, a lot of this stuff we're doing doesn't really matter, because decentralization is the foundation of what we're building. Thank you. And for example, at Chainflow, the infrastructure we build, we hope eventually builds an alternative to the current economy, which we see as inequitable, pretty exclusive, and unfair. So we hope that building the principles of decentralization into all these great things that are being built on top of Solana ultimately create an economy that is much more inclusive, much more equitable, and much more fair, which means really anybody can participate, opening up financial freedom for a wider swath of humanity, if you will, than we have today.
Great, thank you. So there's kind of a couple axes I wanted to maybe, like, start exploring, that we've talked about in the past. There's one sort of, we'll say, like, network infrastructure is a major factor that we talk about when we look at single points of failure or distribution of power and data and its distribution. So I want to talk about this idea of network infrastructure, geographic decentralization, and then I want to talk a little bit about economic decentralization and kind of how Solana is doing on each of those parts. So you guys helped us launch Solana. There were a couple dozen validators, right? This was 2.5, 3 years ago. And today, the network stands, there's close to 2,000 validators, 1,400 RPC nodes in, I think, 33 countries all over the world. So I think we're doing pretty good. But Felix, maybe you can kind of talk to, like, what have you seen around this geographic spread of Solana, and sort of what does that mean for any sort of centralizing or decentralizing factors?
Sure, yeah. First of all, yeah, thanks for having me. Great to be here and great to see a second Breakpoint being such a success and being back in Lisbon where I actually stay, so it's awesome. I think really what always struck us about Solana was really important was that there was a lot of value put on the validators of the system actually running the network, like from the very beginning by running the Tour de Sol and really being supportive of people that join the network to kind of just maintain it, which is not necessarily true in other ecosystems. And I think the Solana Foundation kind of delegation program really took that also to a new level where you really kind of introduced metrics to look at, like kind of the data center concentration and kind of distribute the stake based on these things, which I think really helped foster a more broad validator ecosystem, because obviously there is kind of a limit to how many people actually want to run a validator and maybe even like turn it into an actual business to make that do it full time. I think there's a bunch of hobbyists and then there's basically a bunch of professional validators, and I think the Solana Foundation does a great job at like trying to bring people that maybe want to run on Node on their own, kind of kickstart their journey into becoming a professional validator. And you can obviously see the success of it in the geographies and just the number of validators that are out there. Truly with Solana, I guess one of the issues is you actually need very good network and the infrastructure or like hardware. So that makes it a little bit harder to run it all over the place. So you have like kind of a concentration, obviously in the US, in Europe. But I guess these are like things that hopefully will be solved in the long run as the other regions like Africa and stuff maybe will get like more better infrastructure there to have also more validators in such regions. But overall, I think very good trajectory and amazing work so far. So
thank you. Yeah, and just sort of follow on point on that. You know, this has been and still remains like the core tenet of what Solana Foundation is here for, is to continue to foster the decentralization of Solana. And that comes in many forms. And we initially, have focused on the validator network itself, helping more validators learn how to operate on the network, how to get stake through Foundation's delegation program. As Felix mentioned, there tends to be, and we see this in a lot of proof-of-stake networks, concentrations in North America and Western Europe. We've been working with a number of service providers, some of whom are here, they're in the back corner, go say hello, that are really Solana friendly, they're very crypto friendly, and want to help spread the validator infrastructure to the far corners of the earth, to wherever the users are. There is a need for Solana nodes, Solana infrastructure, Solana RPC operators, and so Foundation has really been advocating with a lot of these big companies who really knew nothing about crypto a handful of years ago, to understand sort of the unique needs of the network, to help bring more avenues for our users. So Chris, I kind of want to talk about this idea of economic decentralization. There's one metric we often talk about, Nakamoto coefficient. Refers to kind of the distribution or concentration of stake on a subset of validators. I know you have Nakaflow, you do a lot of research comparing Nakamoto coefficient and stake concentration on various proof-of-stake networks. So maybe can you kind of talk to what this is, why does it matter, and how does Solana compare in sort of the broader proof-of-stake crypto ecosystem?
Sure. So I guess in the shortest version is the Nakamoto coefficient is the number of validators that control 33% of stake on the network. And in the case of, 33% gives a lot of power to those validators that control 33% of stake on the network. So we feel the Nakamoto coefficient is a meaningful metric of essentially how decentralized stake on the network is. Again, it's not the only metric, and we'll get into some of the other metrics that matter too. But we find that it's often difficult to talk about decentralization. We think the Nakamoto coefficient is one way to get the idea of decentralization across to a wide variety of people. And it's also a pretty easy metric to compare. Well, it's a metric to compare across networks. So we have a site called nakaflow.io, and we monitor the Nakamoto coefficient on about 15 different networks. And for Solana, Solana is consistently at the top. which is good news. I looked today, Solana's at about 30, so that means 30 validators control 33% of the network. And when you look at many of the others, 30 is consistently at the top. Most of the others fall around, you have everything from very low single digits, like 2 or 3. There's another consolidation around maybe 6 or 7. And then once you get up to 30, 30 is looking pretty strong comparatively. There's one other network that, 1 or 2 other networks that bounce around up there too, but 30 comparatively to the other networks we track look pretty strong.
Can you maybe speak to a little bit, what are some of the limitations of looking at this particular number, right? It serves as a useful metric, but kind of, can you maybe elaborate, like what parts of the story does this sort of just numerical metric fail to, what parts of the story does it not always get across?
Sure, so when I think about decentralization, I think at 2 very broad levels. The first level is the capital level, and then the next level is the infrastructure level. So the Nakamoto coefficient starts to tell the story at the capital accumulation level. And capital accumulation has typically been a barrier of entry in the current economy, so I watch that carefully to see if it'll continue to be a barrier to entry in this new economy we're building. So it starts to tell a pretty good story at the capital layer. However, I looked today, of the 30 validators, in the Solana Nakamoto coefficient, there are probably about 10 that are running anonymously. So we really don't know who is running those nodes. So it could be that there's one entity that's actually running multiple validators. Within that 30, we don't know. So that's one limitation. We don't necessarily know who is running all the validators in not just the Solana Nakamoto coefficient, but any other network too. So to really understand what the Nakamoto coefficient means and how useful it is, you have to understand the actual operator or the capital owner behind the validator you see in that list. The second part, I'd say that the Nakamoto coefficient we show is really the capital Nakamoto coefficient. The infrastructure Nakamoto coefficient that tools like Validators app will start to show the second really important vector when it comes to decentralization, which is the infrastructure layer. And that is basically saying things like, how many validators are operating out of which provider, how many operators are operating out of which data center. And as we've seen recently with what happened with one of the biggest providers, Hetzner, or previous providers, Hetzner, this matters a lot too. So the Nakamoto coefficient, when you're talking about capital accumulation and capital distribution, is one vector, but infrastructure is another big vector, if not as important a vector.
Yeah. A common criticism that I think we tend to see on Solana and externally a little bit more broadly on proof-of-stake networks is this, seeing this capital flow to, the highly staked validators. Because people say, oh well, these stakers, don't care about decentralization, or maybe are just uninformed or have different opinions. There's kind of this common theme that it's not just capital concentration, but it's access to capital, access to being able to run your own validator, to participate in the network either through, reading blockchain data if you're running RPCs, APIs, or the ability to, join the network and be a block producer. One thing that, I think Solana in the early days had received some criticism for is that the technical and the hardware requirements to run a validator are quite high compared to, I'll say, earlier proof-of-stake networks. And this is true, they are higher. And the reality is hardware gets cheaper, internet gets faster year over year. And so this is, we want to come in with the strongest tech, the most innovative tech, and that requires kind of pushing the boundaries on a lot of different fronts. And hardware was one of them, where we can squeeze out this performance that we have on Solana. And a lot of people have argued in the past that this is a centralizing factor on Solana. The cost to run a validator is quite high. The operating costs are high. The intellectual barrier is high. Felix, I'm wondering maybe kind of what your thoughts are on that. Is this a driver of centralization on Solana, or a different take?
I think there are basically trade-offs, right, that every network will make in terms of how much they want to enable decentralization. Obviously, one of the factors there is how much hardware, or how hard is it to run a node on really like that hardware level, or and there obviously it is more required of you to run a Solana validator than maybe like one Ethereum node. This is obviously like kind of also an architectural choice of Solana and how it can achieve such a high throughput, because it is maybe more limited and you don't need to have so much communication overhead. So one of the maybe also untold stories going a bit back is that kind of the more validators you add, the more vote transactions there are, the more kind of slower the block times potentially get. So there's really this trade-off where you want to kind of be somewhere in between. You want to have enough nodes that it is decentralized, whatever that means to you. So the Nakamoto coefficient might be one of the metrics there, that you basically don't want just a few entities to be able to halt your network or something, but you also want to add so many validators that the network gets super slow and the applications can't run on it anymore. So I think finding this balance is something that we also try to help people do. And I think there are multiple tools, for example, to calculate how much would you earn if you're in a certain validator in the set. You can maybe like calculate your operating costs. You can see the vote fees, how much you would be paying, and then basically as a validator you need to like figure out if that's profitable for you, right? There's a certain break-even point essentially of amount of stake that you need to be profitable, and then I guess for you as validator this might be the calculation that you need to do to kind of figure out, should I join Solana network? Do I have the chance to get into the set and stay with on top of this break-even line essentially? And I guess the network or foundation and the community at large can kind of maybe communicate with each other what is like the level of number of nodes that we find reasonable that we need to actually be decentralized, because there's obviously this trade-off, decentralization and performance.
Right. So one kind of train of thought I've been debating with some folks recently is this idea that decentralization as an ideal is wonderful, but I think decentralization should also be profitable. I think people should be able to act in their own self-interest, as people naturally do. They want privacy, they want security, they want the ability to have create business models and revenue streams and make money and just have a prosperous life. And how can people seeking in their own self-interest, advance decentralization? And one of the things we've been talking about is, like you said, requirements to run a validator are high, but if someone can, make a capital risk and says, I'm going to put in the time to invest in learning and research and acquire high-quality hardware, and I'm going to run my own node, put a shingle out there, work to attract stake, because they want to succeed on the network. This would hopefully and naturally increase decentralization if there is, a path to victory, a path to profit, basically, for people who want to run their own node. And so I would actually argue that decentralization will be an emergent property, or I'll say further decentralization and self-sustaining long-term decentralization of the network would be an emergent property of a well-adopted and successful network with lots of users on it. So how do we get there? Two kind of big tools that have come up in the last year or so are stake pools and MEV, which can provide additional possible stake, revenue streams, and provide sort of a more competitive landscape for validators to differentiate themselves. So Chris, maybe can you talk a little bit about what you see on stake pools and this idea of liquid staking on Solana? Is it beneficial? Has it succeeded in providing these opportunities, and kind of what work remains?
Sure. So I think the algorithmic stake pools are a really good idea. I've always been a fan of algorithmic, meaning that if you delegate to a stake pool, there's an algorithm in place that then delegates to a selected number of validators based on certain criteria. And the algorithms I typically favor are the algorithms that take decentralization into account. For example, if you already have a lot of stake, you're not going to get a lot of stake. If you're in a data center that already has a lot of validators, you're probably not going to get a lot of stake either. So I really support these algorithmic stake pools in that I think that it's an easy way for a delegator who cares about decentralization to make a difference. I think in terms of aligning economic incentives at the same time, for the delegator, it also spreads risk because you don't really have to think about who you're staking to. You trust the algorithm, which is open source and transparent, to stake to good validators for you. And if a validator goes down, you don't have to worry about restaking yourself. Essentially, the pool is going to do it for you. So I think that stake pools are a really strong tool to increase decentralization on the network in the long term. I think the uptake on it so far isn't where it could be and should be. And I think the more we can get stake into algorithmic stake pools, the more decentralized the network will be over the long term.
Great. And Felix, Chorus One was one of the early and kind of major developers of Lido. You helped bring Lido to Lido liquid staking to Solana. I'm kind of curious, what's your take? How does Lido view this, this topic, and how is sort of the Lido adoption on Solana kind of moving us in a centralization or decentralization direction?
Right, yeah, totally. I think, generally speaking, right, stake pools enable what you said, like basically distributing based on some algorithmic choice. Lido has so far kind of taken the another approach to stake distribution, which is more governance-based and kind of looking at the operators by evaluating them subjectively on like different criteria, and also trying to generate a validator set that is diverse and professional in its operations. And I think maybe like one of the core, like I guess, issue or things that can appear in a stake pool that is algorithmic and really like looks a lot at the performance. So I think can happen that you try to stake a lot to like 0% commission validators, for example, and by that kind of accelerate this race to the bottom for validators that they basically don't earn on providing security to the network, and in the end, that will obviously then kind of put them out of business. Even if they were able to gather stake, they maybe can only stake in the stake pool set if they have 0 commission, so it doesn't really get them anything. So I think there's a certain problem there, but overall I see a lot of potential in stake pools and kind of like experimentation in terms of how to distribute stake and diversify the risk for the sole holders that might not necessarily want to think about which validator should I stake to. And but yeah, I guess there's different types of users and token holders that have different preferences. Some might want to really choose the validator that does the most to contribute to the ecosystem, what they think, or they just go to a stake pool and know they're diversified. So yeah, really like the experimentation. I think it has succeeded to a certain extent. Obviously, it's pretty low adoption still on Solana overall compared to, let's say, Ethereum, where their like liquid staking is very dominating, which is also because of the design of Ethereum staking that is much more not so great in the first place for delegation and for this system of token holders to participate passively in staking. So liquid staking has captured much more market share there.
Mm-hmm. So what we're starting to see here with stake pools and the next thing I want to talk about is the more, as I see it, the more diverse opportunities there are for people to run infrastructure. Just like we've kind of seen with like the DeFi boom in DeFi summer, there were people doing all this experimentation, creating all of these new economic models, trying experiments, some succeeding wildly, some failing wildly, but really creating this really rich ecosystem in which people can build innovative products. And what I'm starting to see, and what I'm really hopeful to see on Solana, is that same kind of economic robustness and a broader playing field for profit and for success at the infrastructure level itself. One really hot topic that comes up around revenue and infrastructure is MEV, right? Maximum extractable value. We've been hearing a lot about MEV on Solana these last couple days, and it doesn't come without risks. A lot of people are concerned that MEV might be a risk to centralization, and I'm kind of curious what, Chris, maybe you can kind of speak to what your view is on that. What are the risks and kind of what are the positive opportunities we might see?
Sure. I'm going to keep the headphones over here. Yeah, I think MEV in general is a positive for validator diversification, especially for smaller operators that don't have the resources to build these tools themselves. So I'm pretty optimistic of it from that perspective. There is the risk, for example, Solana is such a high-speed network that in order to benefit from certain solutions like Jito, for example, validators have to be co-located with the Jito block engines. So for example, Jito now is deployed in Frankfurt first. There's a lot of stake already in Frankfurt, so Jito is also going out and saying, please don't move to Frankfurt because we don't need more stake there. We're going to be deploying other places soon. So I think there is that risk that this can cause further geographic centralization. But I think in terms of capital decentralization, it can be a pretty powerful tool.
Great, thank you. One last question, or kind of topic I want to touch on while we still have a couple minutes here, is the software itself. We've had some really exciting announcements and a fantastic demo here on stage yesterday from Kevin Bowers on the FireDancer team. So as we've been hearing about FireDancer, it's this new implementation for the Solana validator. It's going to have all these wonderful performance improvements. And why do we care from a decentralization standpoint? Why is this better? Solana is the only, outside of Ethereum, is the only proof of stake network to have like a fully independent implementation. Felix, can you maybe speak to that?
Yeah, for sure. So I think, yeah, very important like work stream, and super amazing that someone is working on a second client. I think also because it's gonna kind of improve the spec of the actual Solana client and the Solana Labs client itself. Why you need multiple clients is simply because if you have one client and that has a bug or isn't working, then it can take your entire network down, obviously. If you have like multiple clients, that kind of lowers this risk. I think, yeah, it probably helps to think a bit about, we had it already, that there is kind of this architectural decentralization layer and then kind of the capital, or let's say political decentralization, which is more about who holds the stake, who runs the nodes, who are the entities that actually run them. And I guess the client diversity question is within that architectural level. But I think, now on this talk, unfortunately, we only had like half an hour, and we mostly talked, I guess, about kind of the node, the infrastructure side. I think client diversity is obviously one that Solana now is approaching and even improving, but there's still like also other, I think, avenues of decentralization, kind of, for example, who writes the code, who gets to make decisions about the parameters of Solana, and there is obviously, I think, still also like work to be done, I think, and could also be an interesting other discussion, obviously, of how maybe one could involve more people there. Obviously, with Jump building FireDancer, I think that's already like one kind of big contributor that will obviously like play a big role there and learn a lot. I think also with like Jito and other teams that work really close on the core code base, that is like there's more and more teams building on that level too. And yeah, I'm super excited to like see where this is going to take Solana. So yeah, really excited about this development.
Awesome. Thank you very much. So we are at time, so thank you both. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.